Oh, there you are, Chung Hao.
Girl.
Webinar called Leading from the Front of the Classroom. Not really sure I'm going to dig it, but it's, remember the people we went out to,
No, we don't look. You don't want to see what's under there.
All right, looks like we have a couple minutes to start. We'll wait to see if anyone else is signing in, and then I'll give you guys a quick introduction. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We'll get started here shortly.
How you doing today? Right.
Doing great.
Good.
Doing great.
Good. Looking forward to this. I'm Alex.
Hi, Alex. I'm Chung Hao.
Nice
Great to see you.
Yeah, thanks for doing this.
Very excited.
Alex.
Hey, who's that?
It's the voice of Megan.
Hello, Megan. How are you?
Good.
Good. What's shaking these days?
So lots of snow out of trees, actually.
Nice. I wouldn't know anything about it. It's like 75 here.
Oy vey.
All right, Ross, Chung Hao, you guys ready?
I'm ready. This is Ross.
Absolutely.
All right, sounds good. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. NSTOY is very excited to have a webinar presented by Chung Hao Fu from Leading Educators and Ross Weiner from Aspen Institute. They're gonna start us off tonight with their webinar, Leading from the Front of the Classroom, a Roadmap for Teacher Leadership That Works. Take it away.
Great. So thanks for that introduction. This is Ross Weiner from the Aspen Institute. In just a minute, I'll turn it over to Chung Hao to talk a little bit about leading educators. But first, I just want to say thanks to Catherine Bassett and to the network for creating this opportunity. Chung Hao and I have very much been looking forward to this. We're delighted to share these new resources and to share some of our ideas about teacher leadership. And we're especially honored to have the chance to talk with some of you, Teachers of the Year, who obviously have already proven yourselves as teacher leaders. And I think, you know, we're really hoping to contribute to a conversation where policymakers and just the profession more broadly really creates more opportunities for teacher leaders to take on different responsibilities, to actually contribute more to improving public education while maintaining their roles as teachers. So excited to get into the content. In terms of structure, Chung Hao and I will each spend just a couple of minutes introducing you to our respective organizations, and then we'll really dive into the content of the new resources that were released late last year. And throughout, we're really hoping both to field your questions and also to hear your comments and your thoughts on these issues. So Chung Hao?
Definitely. And I just wanted to echo Ross and say thank you to NSTOY and to Catherine Bassett for giving us this opportunity. We are so excited to share these resources and get them into the hands of practitioners and policymakers, as Ross said, so that we can make a real impact on what happens in schools around the country. It's also been a real pleasure to be able to talk with teacher leaders, school leaders, and system leaders about this work, because every time we share, I think we learn a lot about what's happening where the rubber hits the road, and we're really excited to learn from this group and your experiences being this National Network of Teachers of the Year. And just as a small plug, we are very excited to monitor the chat bar throughout the call, so please feel free to chime in with questions, with comments throughout. And as Ross mentioned, we also have built in a few discussion times throughout the presentation. And then for your convenience, we also have included some Twitter handles if you want to amplify the conversation and spread it across outside of this group. So thanks so much, and delighted to be here. As Ross mentioned, just wanted to share really quickly about our work at Leading Educators. So I'm privileged to be the Chief Program Officer at Leading Educators. And for those of you not familiar with our work, our mission is to advance teacher leadership skills and opportunities. And we seek to build a national network that is really focused on teacher leadership as a key driver for student success across the country. As you can see, we're really committed to partnering with schools, with school systems, with individual teacher leaders to make that change happen. And we do have 3 bands of work. We run an individual fellowship for outstanding teacher leaders, as well as a fellowship for school teams, where principals come together with a team of teacher leaders to enact school-wide change. We do some strategic partnerships with school districts like Denver and DC, where we help them to establish teacher leader programming. And with partnerships like Aspen, we're delighted to publish and share what we were learning from our work around the country. And so really excited again for tonight. And then really quickly, I wanted to acknowledge our teacher leader competency framework, for which we owe a lot to Catherine's work and NSTOY's work with the teacher leader model standard. And I'll just share really briefly, this forms the basis of what we do at Leading Educators. And the way that we came to this actually was by listening to teacher leaders and our partners around what kinds of functions teacher leaders were serving in their schools. And so I'll just share that framework, which is widely available, and we're happy to share it with anyone who might be interested, is based around teacher leader roles that focus on coaching others, on leading teams, and around driving school-wide change, that yellow column that we call driving initiatives, as well as include skills around how teacher leaders continue to grow their practice in developing themselves, the core values of teacher leaders, and how they help to build a vision of excellent instruction and culture across their schools. And so that's just a little bit about Leading Educators to frame our work, and I'll pass it over to Ross.
Great, thanks, Chung Hao. And so just a little bit about the Aspen Institute. So the Education and Society program that I run, and I'll talk about in just a minute, sits within a broader organization. The Aspen Institute, as you can see on the screen, it's really an organization with a broader mission that's focused on creating space for non-ideological, non-partisan dialogue and really helping people figure out sort of vexing issues of public policy. And if you'll advance, Chung Hao, at the Education and Society program in particular, as you can see, our mission is to really improve public education by inspiring, informing, and influencing. And we really try to cut across policy and practice and to look at those spaces within the work where really policymakers need to have a better understanding of the realities on the ground, the realities in schools, how policies play out, and also create opportunities for practitioner leaders to have a better sense of what are the opportunities in policy and what are the opportunities also to influence policy more with that practitioner perspective. So in terms of our core strands of work, we run a number of ongoing networks. Most of them are with urban district leaders. We run networks of superintendents, of chief academic officers, of literacy leaders, of chief financial officers. And we also do something called the Common Core Collaborative, where over these last few years, we've really dug in more deeply with a small set of the districts we work with so that we could really come to understand more what's the reality of Common Core implementation, what are the real challenges that need more resources, need more focus. We also do some similar things on the policy front. So we network senior congressional staffers whose full-time job is education policy, and we provide opportunities for them to learn how does federal policy actually play out in the field. What are people frustrated by? What are they taking advantage of? So that those staffers are in a better position to improve policy over time. Then we bring together ad hoc meetings sometimes, and finally create tools and resources. And so just quickly, in terms of those tools and resources, if you look on the next slide, you'll see just some examples of some of the work we've been doing over the last several years. We really have tried to throw ourselves into Common Core because it seems like there's such an inspiring ambition within the Common Core standards, but we recognize it's going to take so much work to actually bring that to reality. So we've created a number of resources. Again, just really quickly, you see that on the top left, a primer on close reading of text, because that issue on close reading had become so controversial and I think so misunderstood in terms of the important but also limited role that close reading plays in a more comprehensive literacy strategy. And on the bottom right, you see teaching to the core. We partnered with CCSSO to develop some policy recommendations on how states could make sure that Common Core and the teacher effectiveness work really hung together as two parts of a whole as opposed to two parallel policy initiatives. And finally, in the middle, you'll see this implementation of the Common Core standards, this transition guide for schools. And this really grew out of this recognition that Common Core is going to demand really strong systems at the school level in terms of leadership teams, shared vision, real strong practices around professional learning. And so, Chung-Hao, if you'll go to the next slide, one of the things that we did with that transition guide is we created a resource called corereadyschools.org that's really a self-assessment and then connects you both with a sort of a dashboard of your own assessment of the practices in your school and then a library of resources to help work on those things. And so final thing just on the Aspen resources, and if you'll just advance, we've created a digital resource library. It's aspendrl.org that houses all of the things that we've produced over the last few years. And so, Chung-Hao, if you'll advance again, I think we'll get into the meat of the program tonight. So, over the last few years, in addition to focusing on Common Core, the Aspen Institute program has really had a focus on strengthening human capital practices in public education. And we really start with a broad question of how can public education attract and develop and retain and deploy the most talent for the greatest improvement in student learning. And, you know, over these last several years, we sort of watched the teacher evaluation work develop, and I think we had sort of two big reactions. One was that, yes, teacher evaluation needs to be more rigorous and more meaningful, but that two, teacher evaluation on its own just isn't capable of improving teaching and learning as deeply and as our ambitions for teachers and students go. So we really started thinking hard about complementary strategies, and we started engaging a number of districts and a number of other organizations in conversations about teacher leadership and how to make sure that we didn't just end with teacher evaluation policies, but really purpose those for identifying potential leaders and then, making sure that new opportunities were created for those teacher leaders. So we partnered with leading educators to create this framework that we'll dive into in just a minute. And if you'll advance, Chung-Hao, one more time, just want to point out that in addition to the sort of overall framework for teacher leadership, we also put out 3 profiles of promising practice. So one looks at the Common Core coaches that were deployed across the state of Tennessee and really came out of that state department. The second looks at team leads in Denver public schools. So in a district context, really looked at a teacher leader role that we'll get to talk a little bit more about later on, but that really fit and created a new role for teachers in terms of really helping to deepen and strengthen the teacher evaluation and support work in Denver. And then finally looked at how this plays out also in a charter network, the Noble Street Charter Schools in Chicago, where teacher leaders have really been purposed to almost be guardians of the school culture that was so important to maintaining the vision that they had in the Noble Street schools. And Chung Hao, let me turn it back to you.
Thank you, Ross. So diving into the paper, this is what we have affectionately been calling the preaching to the choir slide, because none of this here I think will be surprising to this audience. But we have two really key reasons that we'd like to highlight for why teacher leadership is such an important movement. The first, as Ross mentioned, that no matter what the core initiative might be, whether it's teacher evaluation or Common Core or principal or teacher retention, none of these initiatives could succeed without teacher leadership. And I think we've seen over and over again that heroic versions of leadership where one person is sent to create improvement across a system or in a school doesn't necessarily lead to sustained change. And what we really need are systems that build the capacity of teams and that empower high-performing teachers to take greater ownership over the improvement of schools. And the second slide highlights from a human capital perspective that teacher leadership helps us to create professional opportunities that would actually attract, retain, and develop high-quality talent. We have drawn a lot of inspiration from the U.S. Department of Education's Respect Project and all kinds of initiatives that have been working to professionalize the profession. And we think from both perspectives, teacher leaderships offer something incredibly important. One, from the initiatives that need to get done, and two, from the profession that we want to create. And with that, I'll turn it back to Ross to highlight some of the key lessons learned as we were researching this framework.
Yeah, so the first is that teacher leadership really can't be pursued sort of on its own as its own end. It's got to be embedded and really integrated with other core work in the district. And I think that in a number of places that we've studied or tried to work with, I think one of the things we've seen, well, a couple of things that have happened is, one, there'll be a grant opportunity, and so sort of teacher leadership ends up getting pursued because there are resources on the table. And I think one of the challenges is then it has its own budget, it has its own timeline, it has its own deliverables, and I think sometimes there can be challenges then where the district also has other priorities, and if it wasn't designed at the front end to make sure that teacher leadership was really going to be really a way of advancing that the sort of the most important, the most vital work of the district, that you run into problems in terms of sustainability and also just in terms of turf. And sort of, so one is that you really got to make sure that teacher leadership, again, isn't just a recognition and reward strategy, but it's actually more central to advancing the educational mission. The second key lesson that we feel like has occurred to us is that we've got to acknowledge that this is not just about sort of the technical work of defining new roles, of identifying the right people, providing the right training. There's actually a cultural aspect of this, and this is about redefining sort of the profession, the work in schools. And I think one of the things that we've been struck by was even in places that took a fairly inclusive approach up front, engaged multiple stakeholders, I think once they got into operationalizing the work, we saw that a number of places were surprised, in particular by how hard it was for principals to reconcile themselves to this new role and to really think about, what does this mean for me as a principal to have this new relationship with other leaders in the school, not folks who are full-time administrators, not folks who are full-time teachers. And I think that it's just been striking to us that sort of this, even if you address all of the technical aspects, that there's this cultural aspect that needs attention as well. And the last, in terms of the lessons that sort of highlighted for us, was this sense of that it really requires alignment across a lot of functions in a school and in a system, and that you can't just have this come out of the human capital office and just train teacher leaders, that teachers themselves, actually even teachers who aren't taking teacher leadership roles right now, they also need actually to have a process of understanding, well, what is this teacher leadership role? How am I as a classroom teacher supposed to relate to it? What's this new relationship going to look like? And that too often, I think, or we've seen places where they really only focus the training and development on teacher leaders, and then recognized that principal supervisors, principals, classroom teachers, other folks in central office also needed to be oriented to the new teacher leadership roles, and needed some professional development in terms of how to integrate that work with theirs. And Chung Hao, I would love if you have anything to add to that, and then we'll turn it back to you for the other for more of the content.
For sure, and I think number 2 especially has come up over and over again in terms of the culture shift. And one of the things that I think we didn't realize when we undertook this work at first is that as teacher leaders become more empowered, others in the system have to be willing to let go of some of the authority that they used to have over certain pieces. And I think that process is really quite difficult, because we tend to think of change as a moving towards without thinking about change as a letting go. And I think both pieces are really, and it's not just the principals, but as Ross, as you were mentioning, from people who might be at the district level delivering PD or making curriculum choices across the entire system. If we're really going to empower teacher leaders to have more of those responsibilities, then folks also have to be comfortable letting go. And I think that's really uncomfortable, in part because the accountability systems don't align. And so I think we can talk a little bit about things that we're seeing in different states and systems that have started to address those issues. As we sally forth, one thing that we thought was a helpful frame is a piece that's not in the paper, but came up after it was published. This comes from Orchard Gardens, a really teacher leadership model school in Boston. It's a turnaround school that is in partnership with Teach Plus. Their director of teacher leadership, Toby Romer, shared this model with us. And I think it's been really helpful for my own thinking to understand how people tend to frame teacher leadership. On the left, you see this understanding of teacher leadership as a strategy to distribute workload. This is more of a top-down approach to teacher leadership, whereas principal or administrative team works with teacher leaders to break more responsibility.
One of our first schools as one of their examples.
I'm sorry?
Do you understand what I'm saying to you? They're using Orchard Gardens.
Great. So just sharing this one particular frame from the school as far as distributing responsibilities across the school team. That's a top-down distributing workload approach to teacher leadership. At the same time, the paper really acknowledges a bottom-up approach to teacher leadership, where teacher leaders are empowered to take on more of a voice, and they are actually acting to help the administrative team and leaders at the system level to make better choices, in which case teacher leadership is actually a strategy to select better strategies. And so this isn't directly in the paper, but it's a frame that we think has been really helpful to help people think about teacher leadership as a bi-directional strategy, because both pieces are quite important. Then within the paper itself, one of the keys another key frame that we think has been really helpful is helping policymakers think about teacher leadership as something that where form and function have to match. So by form and function, we really mean that the structures of teacher leadership match the core purpose of teacher leadership. So if we think about form without function, those are situations, and those are on the top left, where we see teacher leadership roles created, perhaps out of a desire to recognize high performers, but those roles aren't aligned with the key priorities in the way that Ross was outlining. And so we see that in those cases, there are limited benefits, and over time we've seen teacher leaders feel marginalized in their roles. So they may have recognition, they may have a new position, they may have a new title, but they don't feel like they have the ability to really impact the kinds of changes that they'd like to see in their school environment. On the other hand, function without form, we also see quite frequently, where teacher leaders are taking on more responsibilities because they've been asked to do more, because they are the high performers. And so they mentor, they work on curriculum, they do all kinds of things, but the kinds of forms that would support that work in terms of release time or additional compensation, additional training, additional supports aren't built in. And so with function without form, there might be increased performance in the short term, but we have seen stories of teacher leaders burning out in those situations. And so what we're really advocating for is a case where form and function come together, where we're backwards designing teacher leadership roles, the way that teachers think about what their standards and objectives are for each lesson. Well, we think the same is true of teacher leaders. If we could backwards design what is a core function of teacher leadership, and then really think about the structures that would support that function, we think we'd have a much more transformative way of approaching things. So this is another key idea from the paper. Finally, before we take a quick discussion, question and answer break, we thought it'd be really helpful to present a way of helping others understand how old teacher leadership and new teacher leadership might differ. Much has been written about the different ways of teacher leadership that have happened. And when we talk to districts and schools about increasing teacher leadership options, we often hear the refrain that we're already doing teacher leadership, that we already have teacher leaders in our schools. And so Ross and I started to wonder, if everyone is already doing teacher leadership, why do we not see real responsibility and empowerment happening at the teacher leader level? So we created this chart as a quick resource to separate old teacher leadership from new teacher leadership. And so as you look across, you'll see that from the roles that are assigned, the authority that teacher leaders have, the time and compensation that's afforded to teacher leaders, the selection and training, there's quite a lot of difference between what old teacher leadership says and what new teacher leadership could be. And so we're really excited about models like those featured in the team leads in Denver Public Schools, where teacher leaders have started to take on more authority, where the roles have a higher bar for selection, where there's increased compensation, and there's real clear responsibilities and accountability. So that is, we think, a really key distinction as we start to think about what new teacher leadership could be. And at this point, Ross and I actually wanted to take a brief moment for discussion. And so if there are any emerging questions that folks would like to chat into the chat bar, we'd love to take them. Please, Alex, and feel free to speak, of course, if it's easier than typing, that is.
All right, thanks. That works for me. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
I'm really curious about when we're talking about getting teacher leaders, when we're talking about getting them trained in order to do these things over on the right-hand side with the new teacher leadership, what are the actual real skills that you're finding that teacher leaders need in order to, take on real leadership roles, as opposed to just saying, okay, you're a leader now, go get it done. But what are the actual real skills that you're finding that teachers need in order to really effectively lead at their schools or throughout their communities?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first thing, even before teacher leaders start to lead, we know that if someone is to both teach and to lead, there's limited times in the day. And that's just by definition that there's multiple things happening. And so really having clarity up front as far as what's in that leadership part of teacher leadership, what are the key goals and initiatives that they're driving? And from that, I think that often takes a lot of clarity at the leadership team level across the school, so that if a teacher leader is, say, coaching peers, there's not confusion about where the teacher leadership's responsibilities might intersect in instructional coaches. And we've seen that kind of thing happen quite a bit in a school system. And so once there's clarity around what teacher leaders are actually doing, we've seen a lot of successes. So in DC, we're partnering with 21 schools there in a program called TLI. And in that program, teacher leaders are given quite a bit of release time to take on initiatives that are key to their schools. And so we've seen a lot of success with teacher leaders leading student culture work, coaching and mentoring new teachers, leading blended learning initiatives, There's one school that's experimenting with a standards-based mastery curriculum where the scheduling is a little more flexible. And so in all those things, we've seen teacher leaders lead in different ways. And so depending on what they're leading, the skills are obviously different. Some of the trends that we see are really around personal leadership in terms of being more self-aware, in terms of learning how to influence others. Coaching skills are often very important, meeting facilitation, facilitating adult PD. We've seen quite a wide variety, but I think a lot of it depends on the specific roles that teacher leaders are taking up.
Great,
Ross, I don't know if you'd like to add anything to that.
No, I thought that was great. I saw one question come across the transom about endorsement. What are our thinkings about sort of endorsement of licensure of teacher leaders? So I'll just take that one quickly, and Chung Hao will invite you to, or anybody else to offer their sort of opinions and perspective on this. But my own sense is that we need a lot of R&D and experimentation and innovation before we lock certain definitions and prerequisites into policy. So I think endorsements actually can play a role in this, but I think we should learn from our history where, endorsements and certifications can take on a sort of a bureaucratic life of their own and get unmoored from the substantive goal. And, there's this, or I shouldn't say huge, but this growing movement towards, competency-based education, towards badging, and sort of micro-credentialing. And I think that may be something where, it would be great if we could start to really document the demonstrated leadership skills that teacher leaders have demonstrated, and be able to allow people to sort of represent that and bring that with them. But I think I would be cautious about too quickly moving to something that had very defined prerequisites and again, a sort of a bureaucratic administrative process while we're still really trying to figure out the substance of the work.
Yeah, I think I'll just add to that we are one of the few providers of the teacher leader endorsement in the state of Louisiana. And we haven't seen a lot of demand for that particular endorsement yet. And we've spoken with a few other states where they're having a similar experience. And now that may not be universally true. And I think part of it is because it's not really clear what it signals when one has a teacher leader endorsement. Because there are so many functions, as Alex and I were just talking about, as far as whether, does that mean I can facilitate really strong data meetings? Does it mean I'm an excellent facilitator of adult learning? Does it mean I will be able to help others get better with student culture? It's just a little amorphous. And so I think given that, it's a little, I think it's something that we're really excited to see and really important, but it does feel very early still. Ross, shall we take maybe 2 more questions and then share the second half of the presentation and take more at the end?
Sure.
Sure. Anyone want to give voice to their question? A lot of activity, obviously, in the chat bar.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I have a question. I'm actually participating in the Teacher Leadership Initiative in Maryland in Prince George's County. And I would like you to speak a little bit more about actually creating these teacher leadership positions, because as you've mentioned, many of them are experimental. They're positions that yet have to be created. Can you speak a little bit more about some of the initiatives in Denver, how they got started? I'm a special education teacher, and I'm particularly interested in reforming special education within my county. So I just like some suggestions of how to get started. What are some good starting points?
Great. Ross, would you like to take that, or would you like me to?
Well, why don't you, I think that broader frame about like what are the different ways teacher leaders can approach that role, and like what are the different avenues for influencing. If you would speak some to that, and however much you want in Denver, and then I might flesh out a little bit of the Denver story.
Sounds great. It's always tricky when you're co-facilitating with someone 2,000 miles away. So I'll start with the Denver story, and then share maybe some principles that we've seen. So in Denver, it was really interesting because the district was quite thoughtful about what should be created centrally at the district level, and what should be created at the school level. And they were really nervous as a system about dictating centrally what teacher leadership should look like, given that schools were in different places and the cultures of individual schools and the priority of individual schools were quite different. And so the the district had schools apply that were interested in creating teacher leadership roles. They had a convening, and they worked with the schools to develop the new roles. What was interesting, when the schools were first invited to create teacher leadership roles, Denver found that there wasn't a lot of creativity. There wasn't a lot of new teacher leadership, to reference the chart that we're looking at, in part because there weren't models that people were familiar with for what it could look like in terms of release time and scheduling and new responsibilities. So it did take a lot of collaboration to come to models. And I do think that collaboration is really key. When we've worked with systems where the roles are more centrally determined, we often find that there's less buy-in, there's less clarity at the school level, and then the roles may not match exactly what the school really wants to have happen. And so we think that facilitation and creating shared meaning around what teacher leadership will mean in a particular context is a really important part of the process. As far as creating change, we've seen this happen all kinds of ways, from individual teacher leaders who have strong relationships with their principals, creating roles that are unique to their schools. We see this quite a lot in our fellowship program. To teacher leaders working together with their union to lobby the district. And so I think it does depend on, again, on local context and relationships, and I think that's quite a vague answer, but I'll turn it over to Ross.
Well, so just to reiterate the point about Denver, I think there was a willingness, there was, I think, a sense that the most senior leadership in Denver, that they very much wanted to activate teacher leadership, but also really did want to have a couple of years where it was a somewhat more organic process, and so they were very loose on how teacher leaders were selected, what roles they were supposed to play. And I think they watched and they saw there were, some schools that had standouts, but as Chung Hao pointed out, I think they didn't see lots of the most innovative approaches, and they realized, okay, we're going to need to provide this kind of support. But they also then had a group of teachers who had been identified within their schools as teacher leaders, and they ran focus groups with those teachers and started to have conversations about what is it that you want, what is it that you need, so that they really let the process develop somewhat more organically. And I think that it has then allowed them to do more ambitious things than some other places. And they still have, struggles and challenges. I don't want to hold it out as, the model that everybody should develop, but I think that's one aspect that is admirable of the way they've approached this.
Yeah. I think that, and just to share, we've seen that at the state level too, in both Tennessee and Iowa, where you have Paul Fleming's team that leads teacher leadership work in Tennessee, invite districts that are interested in developing new teacher leadership roles, come together to create those roles. And the state's job is really to convene and offer some technical support, but the roles are really coming from the needs of the district. And I think in the state of Iowa, where the legislature passed funding for teacher leadership roles, the state provided some teacher leadership models, but still allowed districts who are interested in innovating to create new teacher leadership models. And I think that's a really nice balance that we're seeing, that there are pieces of teacher leadership that people can help others shape, but there's still got to be some kind of customization that happens closer to where the work is really happening. Should we take one more question before we dive back into the rest of the presentation? There's lots of great ones in the chat bar, so if anyone wants to give voice to theirs. Going once, twice. Great. Well, Ross, why don't we keep going with the presentation, and then we can come back to questions at the end.
That sounds great. So if you'll advance to the next slide. So really what we're calling this roadmap, there's really 4 steps. So it's about design, and then knowing your context, defining the measures and doing that as a part of the process up front and not waiting until you're already into the initiative to decide what success would look like, and finally actually building out the program. So we'll just spend just a couple of minutes on each of these. In terms of designing for impact, this really goes back to that first key lesson about making sure that really teacher leadership is immediately and by design put in, like, is advancing critical goals of the school and the system from the get-go, not as, again, sort of a standalone, just a recognition and reward strategy. And so when I think of, the profiles that we had put out, Denver, Tom Boasberg, the superintendent in Denver, was very clear that when he had come actually from the private sector,